Wow, I can really feel a lot of appreciation and love in this room. So a round of applause for yourselves, please. And happy birthday to you, ma'am, again, from the bottom of my heart. Thank you, Executive Honorable Minister, Madam from the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Justice, ladies and gentlemen, and all protocols observed. What I plan to do today, as I was instructed, was to say a few things around free education, whether it's working, and how do we return the agency to the communities. And I think that is going to be very important. This, the slides. So what I'm going to cover today is maybe looking at what we know about free education in Eastern and Southern Africa, and maybe a little bit about globally, and then maybe zoom in on Namibia a little bit to clarify the concept of what free education is and what it is not. What does free education in Africa look like, and free education in Namibia more specifically. We'll also look at maybe some of the impacts of free education, some evidence that we have that we'll try and portray to you to see how it affects various parts of education when free education is implemented. And then we'll look at a few challenges, and then maybe we'll round off with a few things to think about and a few recommendations from my side. So, what is the purpose of free education? I think the first and foremost purpose is to basically remove the financial barriers that is stopping our children from getting the education that they need. I think that's the basic underlying purpose of it. And then, of course, it is also to comply with various commitments that the country has made through its constitutions or acts and how they implement it. What are the types of free education? And I know you have delved into this in your regional meetings, but just to put it out there, we have fees that are paid in the educational institutions, in one side, then we have fees paid outside the institutions, educational institutions. And within both, we look at what are the fees that are required for the attendance of children in school, and what are the ones that are not really directly connected to their attendance in school. So if you look at the left-hand side corner, we look at the basics ones, the ones that always come up: enrollment, admission fees, tuition fees, exam fees, and a very important one. On the fees that are outside, we look at things like uniform, textbooks for attending school. Again, if you look at the bottom, I have mentioned as a caveat that these are different in different countries, and we need to look at what's actually happening in our own country. And what are not required for school attendance, like private tuitions, tutoring, canteens, extracurricular activities, things like that. So these are, in a nutshell, let's say, the types of fees that are related to children and education. So, what is free education and what it is not? I think we need to look at this quite carefully. So, free education is the partial or total abolition of all fees paid to the education institutions for attendance in school. These include things like enrollment, admission fees, which I mentioned, tuition, and exams. What it is not abolition of all fees. Those that are outside the educational institutions, those not required for school attendance. We need to understand these two. And then, depending on each country, what are the focus of that country in providing free education? So, countries have grouped this to a group of population. So, they are freeing education for example, for girls or vulnerable children. So in a sense, they are targeted to groups of people. The other way they're doing it is by targeting levels of education. So it could be from pre-primary or to primary or lower secondary to upper secondary. And then it is also targeted towards types of schools in the country, but mostly limited to public and state schools. So what is the situation in sub-Saharan Africa currently? Of the 53 countries that have data available, 42 of them, or let's say 79, or almost 80%, have legally guaranteed free education at the primary level as of 2016. Many countries around the world have also included lower secondary. 94 out of 107 low and middle income countries have included this, and including in our region, Botswana and South Africa are not included, but the others have. And many countries in sub-Saharan Africa have also expanded free upper secondary. Examples are like Ghana or Zambia. This is a very interesting graph. If you look at the left side, which is looking at countries in Africa, on the right, it's countries more from the industrial world. And if you look at the two colors of the bars, the pink or the red one are what households are putting in for education, and what the blue ones are what the state is putting in. So you can see a stark difference looking at Africa versus looking at the industrialized countries. But if you look at Namibia, which is the last one, and is circled, it is doing fairly well compared to the other African countries in terms of the state taking the responsibility of education for children. And if you look at the industrial countries, if you look at Finland, for example, which is supposed to have the #1 education system in the world, has almost zero parents' contribution in terms of fees for children going to school. So, what is the situation? I think the one that is really, really important is the whole issue around capitation grants to school. So, the capitation grants of school is to offset the fees that were being paid by parents to schools. In many countries, it is insufficient because the state cannot match the amount of fees that the parents were paying before. It's poorly delivered, it's inadequately targeted. So there's a lot of issues around capitation grant, which is supposed to offset what children were paying. The grants are usually lower, so the schools have to contend with less money to do more with. Grants are not indexed to inflation, and hence the value of the money keeps going down. And also per capita allocation per pupil not account for schools' differences. So, you could have per capita in a large school that gets a lot of money, while remote schools that have low number of payment delays, implementation lag, or, of course, in many places, corruption as well. So I was just looking at what has been happening in Namibia, and quickly just going through stages of how free education has been introduced in Namibia. Looking at 1990, the constitution, where primary education was made free. 2001, when the Education Act came into place, where tuition provided free of charge to learners until 7th grade. School boards were allowed to make compulsory for school development grants at that time. I think the 2013 and 2016 are the two major milestones. One where universal primary education was declared, and the second where universal secondary education was declared. We have the 2017 amendment where school development funds were no longer compulsory, which was a good move. And then, of course, the Basic Education Act of 2020, which for when the payment for compulsory tuition and examination fees and other related fees in respect to the education of learners at any state school was prohibited. And the school development fund was made voluntary. So looking at that and the timeline, just to show what has changed. So if you look at the left column, we have primary education, primary tuition, secondary tuition, examination fees, school development fund, hostel fees, and so forth. While we're looking at the timeline to see which was free and what has been changing in the last several years. So now we can see at the end, we have the first four free and voluntarily, the school development fund made voluntary. So, looking at actual expenditures in Namibia itself, and if you can look at the graph, it shows the timeline when UPE and USE was introduced. It says there was a substantial out-of-pocket spending by parents to amounting to about 8,241 million in 2020, which is a huge amount. The household expenditure on education was around 38 to 59% of what the government was spending, so quite a lot. Household expenditure, that's the yellow line at the bottom, on average was about 5.3 of the required amount. So, evidence and data on what happens when free education is introduced, and this is from around the region as well. So there is, of course, significant increase in enrollment, especially of children, especially of girls, and I've stated an example from Uganda where 150% was increased. Improved literacy rates was seen. Increased government inputs was also seen. The positive side of free education. On the negative sides, though, it was obviously schools were insufficiently funded. There was a deterioration of teachers' motivation because of the lack of funding for the schools. There was a decline in performance in some countries. And I think one of the important ones, if we don't balance this properly, is the disengagement of parents saying, all my responsibility has been taken over by the government, I don't do anything, I disengage myself. And I think that is what we need to counter. So just looking at a few things that have happened, if you look at the trend in pre-primary in Namibia, at 2007, after the introduction of free, you can see how quickly the enrollment rate has gone up, which is really amazing to look at. If you look at primary, and I think this is really important, if you look at the trend, and if the trend continued without free primary, universal primary education, it would have gone straight and not like the red line that you see has suddenly increased, which was after the introduction of universal pre-primary. So a big impact on primary education enrollment. Secondary, we don't see as much a difference, but maybe we will have to see it as the years go forward. We don't see that the trend seems to be going as it was even after the declaration of universal secondary education. Now this graph is quite interesting in terms of and reducing it. If we look at dropout, which also shows a decline, again there is some hiccups, but the general trend seems to be lessening of dropout as universal primary education was declared. We want to also look at learning achievements. Does it affect that? You cannot actually correlate the two statistics that are being put here, one on SACMEC 4 and one on standardized achievement. While in SACMEC, we saw 83.4% Namibian grade 5 children having acceptable levels, and that was in 2013. And in 2018, when the standard achievement test was done, it was 27%. So it seems to have gone down, but we cannot have direct correlation among the two assessments. So this has to be looked into a little carefully. So looking at the key challenges of free education, and in the graph you can see when UPE was put in, and the bars are of course the financing side, and when USE was introduced. So what are the pressures that have been put on schools through free education announcements? One is of course the capitation grant, which we talked about. And then the availability of teachers seems to have been affected. additional infrastructure requirement to cater to increase enrollment, because of free education, and we saw that there was a big increase in enrollment, schools needed to address, or were being challenged to address that issue through additional teachers, infrastructures, etc. Continuing with the challenges and potential pressures on the education budget, we're looking at, so if you look at 2013-14 on the graph, how much, this is education spending growth versus total budget growth. So looking at total budget and expenditure on education growth, you can see when UPE was announced, there was a big growth in education spending growth. It has really gone up. This is looking at the equity aspect of free allocation per learner, and the poverty rate. And you're looking at regions in your country, and the poverty level on the left, and the per pupil allocation on the right. So if you look at, for instance, Harda, which is low on the poverty level, but high on the per pupil capitation grant. So we need to look at this carefully, saying how do we address the equity aspects so that the allocation of funds are made more equitably throughout the country. Just quickly going into financing of education, and I don't know if you've seen this new report from the World Bank, which is trying to correlate or equate education financing to a cake, for instance. So they're basically saying for financing education, we need to have a bigger cake, that's on the left, so more public funding going to education, keeping that up, that trend going upwards, a more tastier cake, which is looking at enhancing efficiencies in education spending, addressing costly repetitions and things like that. And then, of course, looking at a cake that is fairly cut. So looking at the whole equity aspect when we do allocations of financing. So finally, just a few, or say, 4 recommendations or things to consider going forward. One is, of course, trying to build a national consensus, but with full participation and buy-in of the communities. I think this is going to be really, really crucial. And I've listed some of the examples of what other countries have done in the region to try and embrace communities when they're working on policies and implementation of free education. So I think a national consensus through having, so for example, in Uganda, mass media campaigns were made to bring all communities together to see how their voices are brought into the whole discussions around free education. Second one, assessing the status of how the current free education is being implemented. I think that is really, really important. What works, what doesn't work, why doesn't it? It also needs to emphasize the very important role communities and parents play in ensuring that their schools benefit. I think that is also really important to look at. We need to look at voluntary contribution. It doesn't have to be in terms of finances. It could be in terms of labor for school renovations, maintenance, things like that. So, but somehow to get their contribution, to feel that they have some ownership in the whole free education and the way the schools are being run. And lastly, getting them involved in actually monitoring the mechanisms of implementation of free education, how resources are being allocated, how it is governed, and what is the accountability. I think getting them involved in all of that brings a lot more involvement of communities and brings in the feeling of ownership of their schools to the communities. And I think that is really, really important. So just 2 or 3 quick takeaway messages. Education is the sector that receives the most funding in most of the countries. Yeah. Yet we're not seeing learning happen, learning improve. And I think that is really important to see why, despite getting so much funding, why isn't it happening? Free education, I think, is another thing that keeps coming, and like like it was said, it is a very contentious issue. Free education does not mean everything is free for the community and they don't need to do anything. And I've mentioned this, that they will step away from it, but rather need to bring them on board to try and have their contribution in some form to the whole issue. And then, of course, education cannot just be free. It has to have quality, it needs to benefit everyone, and it is a shared responsibility. And the last slide, just some additional ideas and questions to explore a little further. We need to take a comprehensive assessment of schools' fees paid and what's happening. We really need to understand what is the exact thing that is happening at the school level. We need to take a comprehensive assessment of understanding the current free education policy by different stakeholders, and we need to assess what the gaps and challenges are, and how do we use that assessment to make sure that communities are brought together from national level all the way down to communities to take this initiative forward as a joint effort and not by a singular entity. With that, let me end here, madam. Thank you.